Hello again. This is Taras Kuzio, professor in political science department at the National University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy. We're today going to be talking about how the war in Ukraine that Russia began in 2014, but particularly in 2022 with the full-scale invasion, has expanded to become a global war. This is part of a lecture series I gave to undergraduate and graduate students at the Kiev-Mohyla Academy earlier this year, which we are now opening up for the general public. Today's lecture is really going to be looking at the kind of angles about this war that we haven't looked at or kind of insinuated, but haven't really looked at in a lot of depth until now. And there'll be a mixture of things. One of the areas that I've kind of hinted at, but not really touched, is the entire question of the Russian opposition. One of the reasons why Ukrainian attitudes to the Russian people have deteriorated so much since the full-scale invasion began on the 24th of February 2022 is because of the weak response. This is how Ukrainians see it, the weak response of the Russian opposition, the weak criticism of the Russian opposition. One of the arguments always made by the Russian opposition is that what do you expect we can do? We live in a dictatorship. The prison sentences are really, really bad, which is true. The riot police and KGB, now called FSB, really clamp down hard if we try and go on the streets. All of this is true. You could answer that back in two ways. Look at Iran. Iran is a country which has as worse, if not worse, than Russia, brutal regime, a kind of a medieval theocracy, and yet Iranians seem to be far more willing to go on the streets than Russians. Secondly, why is it that Russians who are supposedly in opposition even don't go on the streets and protest when they live in democratic countries? Most of the, depending on who you quote, 750,000 Russians who fled from Russia in the autumn of 2022. This was in response to Putin's mobilization of the Russian army after the failures in Kharkiv in particular, where the Russians were routed. But did those Russians flee abroad because they were opposed to the war, or more likely the men fled abroad because they didn't want to die in the war? There's no evidence that when these Russians have reached the West that they are involved in opposition activities. To give an example, my own country, Britain. During the Cold War, the largest Ukrainian community in Western Europe was in Britain. Not a huge community, especially by Canadian or American standards, but it was about 30,000 strong. Certainly the largest in Western Europe. We would have demonstrations, pickets, hunger strikes every month. Sometimes just Ukrainians, sometimes Ukrainians with people from the Baltic communities, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, sometimes with Poles, sometimes with others. There would be always something going on outside the Soviet embassy in Notting Hill Gate. It got so active that the Soviet embassy would be continually protesting to the police, that there was always kind of protests and banners and billboards outside the embassy. Today, there's an estimated 150,000 Russians living in England. So that's, what, 5 times more than there were Ukrainians in the Cold War? I don't see a single demonstration outside now the Russian embassy. It's the same building. It's the Russian embassy now in Notting Hill Gate. Not a single picket, protest, hunger strike, demonstration. Why are these 150,000 Russians passive? Why are they not doing more against the war? Why are they not actively going on the streets, handing out it's the kind of things we did, handing out leaflets, hunger strikes, protests, big banners, talking to the media? They're not doing this. So it does feed into the Ukrainian viewpoint, which is now 100 years old, that Russian liberalism seems to end on the Ukrainian border. The number of people in the Russian opposition who are very vocal against the war, like the former international chess winner, Gasparov, he's in the minority. Alexei Navalny, who was, of course, murdered by the Putin's regime in 2024, had a very mixed legacy, and his widow is even more the case, a very mixed legacy on various types of Russian military aggression against Ukraine. Alexei Navalny, actually, he kind of supported the annexation of Crimea in 2014, as did most Russians. The Levada Center, the last remaining independent polling organization in Russia, has tracked that a stable average of about 85% of Russians continue to support the annexation of Crimea. Even though everybody understands that the Russian-Ukrainian war, which is now taking place, began in the Crimea in 2014. Also, many of those members of the Russian opposition, including Alexei Navalny, believe the kind of Putinist, Kremlinist claim that Ukrainians and Russians are not that different, that they somehow are kind of either close or one people. That's also a factor. Alexei Navalny was actually, in the 2000s, when he was more nationalistic, he actually supported the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. He used very racist language against the peoples of the Caucasus in the 2000s, calling them cockroaches. So kind of in the direction of Donald Trump, as it were. And he also condemned the autocephaly, or the independence given to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine from Russia in January 2019. His widow has continued to be very weak when giving interviews in the West. And you can see this on slide 2, an interview she gave to a German newspaper, where Navalnaya actually is opposed to the West providing military aid to Ukraine, is often critical of Western sanctions against Russia. It's really unclear what her position is. It's not very good. It's not very deep, and in many ways even worse than her former husband Alexei Navalny. So yes, a very tragic murder committed, certainly a war crime committed by Putin's regime against Alexei Navalny. But Alexei Navalny was not a popular person inside Ukraine. And this is important to know because what changed between 2014 and 2022 was that in 2014, after the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, most Ukrainians continued to differentiate between the Russian regime and the Russian people. So Ukrainians are very hostile to Russian leaders, to the Russian regime, but they were still not yet hostile, or majority of Ukrainians were not hostile to the Russian people. I mean, the main exception would have always been West Ukrainians. After 2022, that completely changes. After 2022, the absolute majority of Ukrainians have a negative view of both the Russian regime, Russian leaders, and the Russian people. So this is a fundamental change. the number of Ukrainians who held a positive view of the Russian people declines to less than 5%. In other words, East Ukrainians begin to hold the same view of the Russian people, negative view of the Russian people, as West Ukrainians have always had. One of the aspects of why this war has been dragging out, why there's kind of fatigue on both the Ukrainian and maybe the Russian side, is the unwillingness among many people in the West, amongst Western leaders, through their supply of military equipment to Ukraine and through their kind of use of sanctions, but not full use of sanctions, is the fear that Russia would be defeated. The fear that what happens if Russia is defeated, and what happens if Russia is about to be defeated, would Putin then move to nuclear escalation? The Biden administration claims that they had intelligence in the autumn of 2022, after the collapse of the Russian lines in Kharkiv, that Russia was thinking about tactical nuclear weapons. I suspect that a lot of this is simply American disinformation. The idea that Russia would use tactical nuclear weapons makes no military logical sense. It would hurt as many Russian troops as Ukrainian troops, and it wouldn't change the dynamics on the battlefield. It also would mean that Russia would be completely isolated, not only in the Western world, but also isolated from its sort of allies or potential allies like India and China, who would not welcome such a development as the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. It would make Russia a complete pariah, and probably lead to a very robust, this is what the Americans have threatened, a very robust conventional response from the Americans, which would destroy the Russian army in Ukraine and thereby help Ukraine win the war. So the idea that this would have been likely is not true. Nevertheless, this guided American, particularly American policy, the drip feeding of military equipment, and also the unwillingness to completely apply full sanctions against Russia, particularly on the energy question, where Russia's military budget could have been really hit far harder than it actually was. If we go to slide 4, I think one of the factors that Ukrainians have always talked about is the degree to which there's been a lot of double standards in this war. Why is it that, for example, the US is willing to come to the military aid of South Korea, which would be facing a nuclear power, just like Ukraine, in this case, North Korea, or even Taiwan? Why are they so more important than Ukraine, which borders for NATO and for EU members? But more importantly, the double standards question came up when the US assisted Israel in shooting down Iranian missiles and drones that were fired against Israel. On the contrary, the US has actually acted as though it's been playing one of Ukraine's arms behind its back in its inability to fight a fully fledged war against Russia, not allowing the use of US weapons inside Russia, the refusal to impose a no-fly zone, which of course would have helped Ukraine with air defense, the huge numbers of Russian missiles and drones are simply astronomical, which are being fired against Ukraine, the unwillingness to shoot down even Russian missiles and drones that, for example, entered Western Ukraine, which were a potential threat to neighboring NATO members. But also the fact that the US, under both Republican and Democratic presidents, has actually blocked Ukraine from joining NATO. I don't think it's important to focus on small countries like Slovakia and Hungary who are opposed. I don't think they're really crucial in the decision to whether to let or not let Ukraine into NATO. The key countries, of course, are the US. And secondly, the other key country here would have been, of course, Germany. But the reality is the last US president who supported Ukraine's membership of NATO is George Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney, back between 2000 and 2008. From 2009, two Democratic US presidents, Obama and Biden, and one Republican US president, Donald Trump, have all three of them have opposed Ukraine joining NATO. De facto, they have given, and NATO has also given, Russia a veto over Ukraine joining NATO. The US and NATO would never say that openly. They would never say, yes, of course, we've given Russia a veto over Ukraine joining NATO. But there's simply, in my mind, no question that a veto has been given to Russia. Why is it okay for example, Finland and Sweden to be let into NATO like literally within a month or a few months? But Ukraine, this debate over whether to let Ukraine in or not has been dragging out for nearly 2 decades. After all, Finland joining NATO adds on to a massive new border that Russia has to face against a new NATO member. The Finnish-Russian border is even bigger than the Ukrainian-Russian. So I think there's no question that Russia has been given this veto over Ukraine, and this will become a major factor this year in the Trump-led peace negotiations to maybe end the war, because Ukrainians would be more favorably inclined to kind of compromise and move towards some kind of peace deal if that meant that free Ukraine, controlled by Kiev, was allowed to join NATO on, say, the West German model. West Germany joined NATO in 1955 at a time when East Germany was still occupied by the Soviet Union, and then East Germany only joined West Germany in reunification in 1990. So why could not the same approach be applied to Ukraine? Free Ukraine, which is 80% of the territory of Ukraine, joins NATO. The 20% occupied by Russia rejoins Ukraine, reunites with Ukraine at a later date. Putin and nuclear weapons, slide 5. I mean, this is an area that Russia has continuously threatened to use. It's not only Putin, it's the alcoholic Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, who strangely many in the West believe to be some kind of Russian liberal, but now is seen as a kind of unhinged Russian leader. He's deputy head of the Russian Security Council, but also allegedly an alcoholic. Continuously threatened the use of nuclear weapons against the West, threatened even to unleash some kind of nuclear catastrophe at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. But this is a means to prevent the West fully supporting Ukraine militarily. And it's been quite successful with the Americans and Germans in particular, even though most or practically every single Western expert on this question of nuclear weapons has argued that Russia is very unlikely to move in that direction. Simply the numerous negative consequences of moving in that direction of using nukes would be far greater than not using them. Nevertheless, you have incredible statements made all the time by Russian leaders. I mean, again, Sergei Karaganov was seen as a kind of a pro-Western figure in the Russian leadership going back to the 1990s. He headed a kind of unofficial government think tank, Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. But he's also become, like Medvedev, quite unhinged, quite making some quite crazy statements like this one only last year, calling for Russia to do a preemptive nuclear strike against the West to show that that Russia's, determined to hold on to Ukraine and elsewhere. Again, this is just part of this psychological operations against the West as a way to weaken Western resolve in its support for Ukraine. What are Russian red lines? I mean, this is a kind of question that's been talked about, debated over the last three or so years. It's unclear what are Russian red lines. Would Russia really use nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons to defend territory it's stolen and occupied from Ukraine? Of course, Russia claims these are no longer Ukrainian territories. They belong to Russia according to the Russian constitution, but that's only Russia saying that. No other country really supports Russia on this position. At the United Nations, when the question of Russian occupation of Ukrainian land comes up, only 4 countries really back Russia. So even pro-Russian countries like China are usually do not vote together with Russia. They abstain on the whole. Most of these kind of pro-Russian countries abstain, like India, even Iran and China. But the red lines are more pink than red, I would say, and quite vague. Quite vague what these red lines are. It's unclear, and it's basically a psychological operation, as I say, to reduce Western's military support for Ukraine without really constituting any kind of real major threat. The reality is that the Russian army has been proven to not be the second best in the world, and hence the Russian leaders have been forced to fall back onto threats with nuclear weapons. The reason, if we go to slide 8, and this is kind of the main part really of this class, is that when Russia initially launched a full-scale invasion in February 2022, there was no talk then of this invasion being part of a kind of a Russian global attack on the Western international system. That only came later when Russia realized that the special military operation would not be 3 days or a week or 2 weeks. It would actually be a far longer war. It also came about because the Kremlin never realized and miscalculated that the West would provide so much military equipment to Ukraine. The Kremlin was still based on the mythology of 2014, whereby sanctions were weak and Western governments were reluctant to send military equipment to Ukraine. Obama vetoed the sending of weapons to Ukraine, and this was a general view in the United States. A survey of American so-called experts on Russia and Ukraine, published in Foreign Affairs magazine in 2015, had the majority of those experts opposed to the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. The link will be in the slide footnotes again. So this kind of miscalculation was fed into 2022, the assumption that this would be a very quick war, Ukraine would be quickly defeated, the West would just again slap Russia on the wrist, and then it'll be all over very quickly. That didn't happen. Russia was in retreat in the latter part of 2022 with the liberation of Kharkiv and the liberation of Kherson. So Putin had to as it were, provide a new ideological umbrella to his military campaign against Ukraine, and that was a way of redefining what the goals were. Another reason was that this so-called great power had to go cap in hand to a number of countries like Iran, North Korea, China, looking for military equipment that Russia didn't have. Russia never really, prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia never really, for example, invested into drones, which is really surprising. Because countries like Iran had already done so, Israel had done so since the 2000s, and the Armenian-Azerbaijani war in 2020 was in many ways won by Azerbaijan with the use of Israeli and Turkish drones. But this so-called great power was going with cap in hand, and then again it had to bring in these traditionally anti-American, anti-Western countries like Iran, North Korea, and China into some new kind of axis against the West. There was also an attempt by Russia to transform the BRICS organization, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I forget the last country, but certainly most of these countries are rising powers. Of these 5 countries, only really Russia is the declining power. An attempt to transform this alternative to the Western world into some kind of anti-Western, kind of American structure. That didn't work as well, because although India didn't really support Western sanctions against Russia, at the same time, India didn't want to be dragged into a kind of an anti-Western alliance. So what we had by probably early 2023 is the emergence of this anti-Western axis composed of 4 to 5 countries, but particularly Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, maybe some other additional countries as well. I mean, possibly you could have added Syria there, at least while Assad was leader, and maybe Venezuela. But the key countries were undoubtedly the ones providing military support to Russia, and those would have been North Korea, Iran, and China. So if we look at slide 9, we have the emergence of this axis. Whatever it's called, President Bush, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the US, talked about an axis of evil then. But that axis of evil was a bit different to the one today. It then included Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Of course, that's no longer around. Iran responded with what it called the axis of resistance when it began funding proxy groups in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip, the Houthis, and of course supporting the Syrian Assad regime. Now we have something called, it's called by different scholars and experts something different, but a kind of a axis of upheaval, axis of chaos, and it's an axis composed of Iraq is no longer there, but certainly Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. China tries to camouflage itself as not being the full member of such an axis. It claims that it's only exporting dual-use goods to Russia, but that's not true. Again, if we fall back on Western experts on sanctions and on trade, they say that without China's trade support for Russia, and that includes a huge increase in trade going to Russia of dual-use goods since 2022, and China buying a huge amount of Russian oil and gas since then at discounted prices. Without that, Russian military would not be able to function. So China is by far the biggest external enabler of Russia's military machine. Even though China doesn't claim that, doesn't want to accept that, China doesn't want to be portrayed in the same way as, say, Iran and North Korea, which are diehard anti-American, anti-Western. China's also, of course, the biggest hypocrite out here, because Chinese leaders are more nationalist than communists, and they are hardline on the territorial integrity of states. And yet, and for example, on areas like Tibet, Xinjiang, the Muslim area there, and also Taiwan. And yet, when it comes to Ukraine's territorial integrity, they tend to align with Russia, not with Ukraine. So the Chinese, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said, the Chinese want to have their cake and eat it. They're both hypocrites and claim to be, international supporters of territorial integrity, but at the same time are supporting a country, Russia, which is undermining that principle internationally of the territorial integrity of states. The key, of course, in terms of supplying military equipment, North Korea and Iran do that. Iran primarily drones, and in return getting high-end, high-level military technology from Russia, and in the case of North Korea, artillery shells primarily, and more recently, North Korean Special Forces troops, about 10,000, which are being sent to the Kursk region to act as, again, like the Russians, of further cannon fodder. Why are these countries uniting behind Russia? Well, a number of reasons. Obviously, Iran and North Korea have long-standing anti-American regimes. They agree with Russia's position that it was the West, not Russia, that began this war. This is obviously ridiculous. Ukraine did not invade Russia, and even if we blame NATO for beginning this conflict, I mean, as I've said earlier on, Ukraine has never been offered NATO membership, and no US president has supported Ukraine's membership of NATO since George Bush, i.e. since 2008. So the idea of blaming NATO, blaming the West for launching this war is absolutely ridiculous and is completely fake news. They feed into this idea of Western hypocrisy. Certainly, that would be true maybe in the case of Iraq. I mean, that was a completely misguided intervention by the US into Iraq, leading to the disintegration of the Iraqi state and the takeover in many ways of the Shia area of Iraq by Iranian influence. And you could also argue that intervention in Libya was a major Western mistake. But the key example always given is Kosovo. The idea that if it's okay for Kosovo to be independent, why not, therefore, Crimea, or in the case of the Armenians claiming Nagorno-Karabakh? They also feed, the Iranians, the Chinese, the North Koreans also feed into the Russian claim that this is a war to destroy the US-led unipolar world. This alleged kind of US-dominated world, which has existed since the end of the Cold War in 1991, with the idea that we need to return to this Cold War era of a multipolar world where the US would respect Russia as an equal kind of either foe or partner, as it did then, as opposed to how the US and West have not treated Russia fairly and equally since 1991. Importantly, China in particular and Russia want to promote their idea that big powers like them have a natural right to spheres of influence. In the Russian case, of course, this is the former Soviet Union or Eurasia. And central to that is, of course, Ukraine. The idea that the US and Russia should sit down together. So Trump and Putin should sit down together, negotiate a new Yalta agreement, whereby the US blesses and recognizes the former Soviet space as Russia's exclusive sphere of influence, which means that Ukraine, as it were, belongs to Russia. And the same would be the kind of logic would be for the China to dominate Southeast Asia and to possibly occupy and take control of Taiwan. So all of these ideas are there, and they are supported by those other three countries besides Russia. Russian nationalists are portraying the war in Ukraine against a fake country, against a fake identity promoted by the West to deny Russia its natural control, these little Russians, little Russia. And once Ukraine is defeated, it'll again become little Russia, part of the Russian sphere of influence, part of the pan-Russian people. And the West will be forced to recognize Russia as an equal player, as it were. This kind of inferiority complex the Russians have is very deep-seated and very much important in determining their attitudes to the West and particularly to the US. The idea that Russia should be seen as an equal to the US is deeply ingrained. The idea that in the 1990s, Russia was put down, Russia was not respected, and that Putin saved Russia from that humiliation of the 1990s. Even Barack Obama, President Barack Obama, when he described Russia as not a great power, just a regional power, that infuriated of course, Moscow. The irony is, of course, that Russia's image as a great power is in decline. Russia is de facto a Chinese younger brother today. Russian as a great power is nonsensical. I mean, how do you define a great power? Economically, Russia is not an economic power. Its economy is smaller than the size of the Netherlands. It's no longer a kind of an exporter of oil and gas to Europe. Ukraine's refusal to renew the 5-year gas transit agreement, which ended in December 2024, means that the era, 4 decades era of Russia supplying, Soviet Union and then Russia supplying oil and gas to Europe is over. So Russia is now supplying discounted oil and gas to Russia, to China and India. Russian military equipment, which used to be a major source of export earnings, is no longer big. Countries like India are moving away from Russian military equipment because they've seen it to be of poor quality in the war in Ukraine. So where is the technology of this so-called great power that is Russia? China is far, far different. China, as a rising power, is exporting all manner of technology, not only mobile phones, Huawei, but Chinese electric cars are giving electric cars in Europe and in North America a really run for their money. There was an article just a few weeks ago in The Economist about how Chinese electric cars are really, really very good, and they're actually going to be a major export product of China's. What's the equivalent for Russia? Russia doesn't export any technology, simply doesn't. As some American politicians described it, it's basically a gas station masquerading as a country. If we go to slide 11, I think one of the key aspects of this kind of new burgeoning alliance is, of course, the Iranian Russian. Russia had to turn to Iran for drones because Turkey refused to supply Bayraktar drones to Russia. Turkey has also played a kind of a game in this war, but I would say more on Ukraine's side than on Russia's. Turkish leaders always talk about Ukraine's territorial integrity. They have supported Ukraine at the United Nations, and they have always said Crimea belongs to Ukraine. I mean, there's a huge Crimean Tatar population in Turkey since the 19th century, which fled after the Russian invasion of 1783. So Russia turned to Iran for far poorer quality drones, the Shahid drones, which has been using in massive numbers against Ukraine. Iran, of course, is interested in this military alliance with Russia for all sorts of reasons. It provides kind of a strong backing for Iranian objectives in the Middle East. Russia and Iran both supported the Assad regime in Syria. And Russia turned a blind eye to Iranian backing for various proxy groups around the greater Middle East. But that's in retreat now. With the defeat of the Assad regime, Iran and Russia have lost a tremendous amount of influence in the Middle East. And ironically, it is Turkey that is doing military activities that Western governments were too afraid to undertake. Obama talked about and threatened red lines in Syria, but never acted upon them. Turkey did act upon them and removed the Assad regime, and Turkey has been very active in opposing Russian influence in Libya as well. And some of those Russian assets are being transferred from Syria to Libya now. So Turkey actually is playing a very important card here in supporting the West against Russia and against Iran in the greater Middle East. And I suspect that with the coming in of Donald Trump in late January as the new US president, that Iran and Israel will indirectly and officially be given the green light, as it were, to go after the Iranian regime, which now looks very weak. That, of course, would be very good for Ukraine to remove the Iranian regime as a pillar of support for Russia. I think what is interesting here to talk about is why Israel has not come in as a military ally of Ukraine. Israel always claimed it had to be very cautious because whilst Russia was in Syria, it couldn't really back Ukraine in this war. I think this was complete fake news. The reality was that the Israelis were, or the Israeli intelligence was on kind of a extended vacation. Did they really not realize that eventually Russia would be giving nuclear weapons technology to Iran? That's what Iran was always after from Russia. And if Iran became a nuclear weapon state, that would be an existential threat to Israel. So why not counter that by aligning yourself militarily with Ukraine? After all, the logic is there, because this anti-Western axis of upheaval or chaos sees both Israel and Ukraine as Western interloping states, as it were, in areas where they shouldn't exist. Iran's goal is to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Russia's goal is to wipe Ukraine off the face of the map. It seemed this was a natural alliance, but unfortunately, Prime Minister Netanyahu had long been in bed with Vladimir Putin. Many of the Russian Jews who live in Israel were pro-Putin, and this was a constituency that voted for Netanyahu's populist nationalist right in Israeli politics. And so you can see on the internet election banners where Putin and Netanyahu are shaking hands. Now, this should theoretically change. With the removal of the Assad regime, Israelis no longer, or Israeli leaders no longer have an excuse to fall back on this myth that we can't really support Ukraine because Russia's in Syria and it's a delicate situation. That's all gone. The Assad regime's gone. Iranian and Russian influence has gone from Syria. This means that, as I always believed, that this was a myth promoted by Israel. It wasn't the real reason why Israel was reluctant to get into bed with Ukraine in some kind of military alliance. But that is long overdue. Ukraine would benefit from the removal of this tyrannical Iranian regime, and let's hope that Trump gives the green light to Turkey and Israel to do that in the coming months. Iran is now in a very weak position. Let's capitalize on that and give the Iranian people their freedom and liberties. In the case of North Korea, the reasons why it jumps into such an alliance with Russia is it breaks, and this is the country which is the most isolated in the world. It breaks North Korea out of international isolation, out of international sanctions. Russia is undermining the United Nations sanctions against North Korea that Russia voted for together with other countries. It gives the North Korean forces combat experience. They've not had that since the Korean War of the 1950s. It's able to to test North Korean military equipment and to expand the North Korean military industrial complex by providing greater amounts of military equipment to Russia. North Korea is already a nuclear weapon state, but it still would be interested in receiving high-end military equipment from Russia. Of course, Russia in return gets more cannon fodder, which can add to its own Russian cannon fodder to be used in warfare against Ukraine. Prevents Putin going down the road by using North Koreans, also using African mercenaries. It prevents the need for Putin to move down the road of an unpopular mobilization of Russians to go into the army. But the most important thing here, I think, is that, again, like with the Israeli case, why are the South Koreans so passive? South Korea claims that according to its constitution, it cannot provide military equipment to countries at war. Ukrainians have said, we don't want anything for free. We're willing to pay to buy military equipment from South Korea. South Korea is one of the top 10 military producers of military equipment in the world. Ukraine would want that. Surely it's in the interest of South Korea to help Ukraine fighting North Korea when it's obvious that North Korea is getting military experience, military technology, and other forms of benefits, which eventually down the road, the North Koreans will maybe use against South Korea. So it makes logical sense again for South Korea to assist militarily Ukraine. But again, that's not happening as in the Israeli case. For poor Russians, and I say this kind of quite sarcastically, they're now being fed this propaganda on Russian TV, as you'll see in slide 13, that somehow North Korea is this paradise. Forget about the West. Forget about the joys of living in the West or visiting the West for holidays. North Korea is the place to be, and it's actually cringing to watch this compilation of pro-North Korean video clips from Russian TV. What about China, which is the country we'll kind of end up on? China is playing a double-faced game in this war. China, as I've mentioned, is a country which is obsessed with the idea of territorial integrity of states. I mean, after all, China is the country that put into concentration camps 1 million of its Muslim people from Xinjiang because of the fear and threat of separatism in that region of Western China. The brutality of repression has also been witnessed in Tibet against the Tibetans, not necessarily calling for independence, but at least calling for respect for their culture and heritage. So despite China having this obsession with territorial integrity, as we also see in the case of Taiwan, which it demands that Western countries not recognize Taiwan's independence, that Taiwan is just a kind of a renegade province of China. Despite all of that, China is in bed with Russia, which is destroying Ukraine's territorial integrity. So China here is playing completely double standards on the question of the territorial integrity of states. China claims that's the reason why at the United Nations it doesn't support Russia, it just abstains. Well, you know, yeah, abstaining is great, but you know, why don't you then condemn Russia's undermining of the territorial integrity of Ukraine? China has also not supported President Zelensky's peace proposals, which have obviously the fundamental basis of those peace proposals have been that returning Ukraine's territorial integrity, de-occupying areas of Ukraine which have been illegally annexed by Russia. China was initially, I think, quite cautious in 2022 towards what was taking place in this war. And I suspect this was because they believed that Russia was foolhardy. They probably also believed that Russia had the second best army in the world. That proved to not be true. And they saw the resultant chaos and complexities arising from Russia being unable to fulfill its claim that it would quickly subdue Ukraine and impose its own pro-Russian puppet regime in Kiev. When they saw this wasn't happening, I think another factor probably influenced China, and that was that that they saw that the West was relatively cautious. And by the West here, I mean in particular the US. When they saw that the US was not willing to go for the jugular, the West could have gone for Russia's jugular after the Kharkiv rout of Russian forces in September 2022. If the West had gone for, had given Ukraine everything it could have done at that moment, Russia's military could have been defeated in Ukraine. There was simply not enough Russian troops in Ukraine to take on the Ukrainian army at that stage. China saw that the US was not willing to do that. The US was cautious. It was drip feeding military equipment in Ukraine, and the US was giving enough military equipment to Ukraine for it not to be defeated, but not enough for Ukraine to defeat Russia, for Russian military defeat. And then there seems to be a kind of change in Chinese attitudes around the spring of 2023 when Chinese and Russian leaders meet. And then you have the growth of Chinese trade of dual-use goods and military equipment from China to Russia. Of course, China's benefiting from Russia's inability to sell oil and gas to Europe and buying it at discounted prices. But then you have a massive ballooning of Chinese trade with Russia at that stage. One aspect of this which I think is important to bear in mind is that China's watching Western reaction as well because of the potential reaction of the West in the event of China trying to take back Taiwan. Chinese leaders have talked about that they want to take back Taiwan by the end of this decade. And what they're looking at is how the West responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At the moment, they're seeing a kind of half-hearted, you know, it's enough for Ukraine not to be defeated, but not enough for Ukraine to win, kind of approach. So China's very much watching Western political will on this war, um, and wondering to what degree the West would come to, or particularly the US would come to the rescue of Taiwan if China launched a full-scale invasion later this decade. On this slide 15, this is actual proof of the degree to which China is supporting Russia in this war. You can see the massive increase in trade, on exports in particular, from China going to Russia after the full-scale invasion in 2022. Some of this is going direct from China to Russia. Some of it is going via middlemen in Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan have become very important middlemen for the re-export of goods, bypassing Western sanctions to Russia. So that shows you to what extent China is probably the main external enabler of Russia's military machine, despite, of course, China always denying this. The last slide, number 16, kind of takes us into the Trump era, which is coming about at the end of January. Many people would say that 2025 is going to be a crucial year for all sorts of reasons, not only because Trump's coming to power and his obviously ridiculous statement that he's going to resolve the war in 24 hours, which of course will not happen, but the war has potential fatigue problems for Russia as well as for Ukraine. In the case of Russia, these the main areas that Western experts talk about is the impact of this highly militarized economy on the state of Russia's economy, whether it can continue the high levels of inflation, and in particular the financial crisis. The amount of money the Russian state is paying out in terms of, for example, death benefits for Russian dead is quite high, but also the huge amounts of high levels of Russian casualty rates, anything up to 2,000 Russian killed and wounded every day. And as we know, Russian wounded tend to die on the battlefield. Some of them kill themselves. There are many videos of this, or they're simply left to die. They're not retrieved and patched up in the same way as Ukrainian wounded or a NATO member's country would also treat its own wounded, trying to save them. Russian wounded are usually left to die. So when we talk about 2,000 casualties every day, that is killed and wounded, but most of the Russian wounded die for all sorts of reasons. But also, predictions are that Russia is simply too much Russian military equipment, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles are being destroyed. And they cannot be replenished at the rate of the amount of destruction. Russia's dipping into its huge Soviet military stocks, but that should probably end. Those stocks should run out by the end of 2025. So 2025 is a crucial year for Russia here. In the case of Ukraine, I think it's the problem areas are, which I think everybody talks about, are the question of manpower. Ukraine is a smaller country than Russia. It's about population is about a quarter of the Russia size, and Zelensky can be quite criticized for the inability to mobilize or to get as many Ukrainians as required to join the Ukrainian army. Zelensky has refused to lower the conscription rate from 25 to 18 in every Western country and in every war. the main cohort of men joining the army, or this group from 18 to 25. And that's missing from the Ukrainian case. But also, there's a growing and steady number of Ukrainians who are willing to settle for some kind of compromise and to end the war. This doesn't mean that Ukrainians support officially recognizing this occupied areas as Russian. No, that there is no support for that inside Ukraine, but there's certainly support for some kind of peace deal being negotiated. I would say there's more support for that in Ukraine than there is in Russia. Ukraine's economy is actually doing, in some ways, some people would argue, better than Russia's economy. Russia has been unable to destroy Ukraine's energy sector, which is tried very desperately to do. Moving towards the end of this talk and end of this lecture series, what I think is going to be interesting is the degree to which Ukrainians have shown a willingness to Donald Trump of being interested potentially in his team's proposals for ending the war, whereas Russian leaders, Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, Russia's Neanderthal ambassador to the United Nations, all of those people have flat out rejected all of Trump's peace proposals. So that could potentially work in Ukraine's favor. Certainly, I think there's a widespread view that Ukraine needs to enter any peace talks from a position of strength, which probably will mean a bout of increased American military support to Ukraine. A new military offensive by Ukraine in the Kursk region of Russia has begun in the first week of January. And that's obviously, again, another attempt by Ukraine to expand the area of Russia that it controls towards the goal of using this as a bargaining chip in future peace talks. The big question marks are always going to be which countries would be willing to send their troops as peacekeepers along a potential frozen conflict line, and what would be the contents, what would be the actual writing on the wall, as it were, of these so-called security guarantees, which the West would have to give to Ukraine for it to agree to some kind of peace deal. Russia has strongly opposed the kind of ideas floating around that Ukraine would postpone NATO membership for 10 or 20 years. Russia's demands are absolute. Russia's demands are that Ukraine forever say it will never join NATO, which of course no Ukrainian government will ever do. Russia's demands remain the same as what it put forward in the spring of 2022, which is de facto capitulation of Ukraine, again, which no Ukraine leader would ever do, and the Ukrainian public would never agree to. The idea that Ukraine would agree, for example, to only have an army of 50,000 is simply laughable, but this was the Russian demand. But Russia's demands are even greater than that, which are usually ignored in Western analysis of these peace talks. And those demands relate to internal policies of Ukraine. It's not just foreign and defense policies, it's also internal policy. Russia is demanding the policies be revoked inside Ukraine, such as decommunization laws, which were adopted in 2015, language laws, education laws, and laws surrounding of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So Russia is demanding areas which it has absolutely no right to demand, and which Ukrainians will tell them to go take a hike about. These are domestic Ukrainian policies, but of course Russia is demanding, and still is demanding, the kind of little Russianization of Ukraine, which no Ukrainian leader and no Ukrainian public would ever agree to, even East Ukrainians not today. So it's going to be a fascinating period. One has the impression that the Trump team have come to realize that this is going to be far more complicated than negotiating a peace deal in 24 hours. Trump himself has said that the Ukraine-Russian war is more complicated than the Middle East, which it probably is. The core question of these potential peace proposals or negotiations, just like we've discussed in earlier lectures, the core question is Russia's inability to accept Ukraine as an independent state. Russia's demand that Ukraine be Little Russia. Russia's demand that Ukraine become a Little Russian puppet state. This is the crucial issue. Ukraine was never like Belarus, even in the Soviet Union, and historically was never like Belarus, but Russia will only be satisfied, Russian imperial nationalists like Putin will only be satisfied when Ukraine has a puppet leader like Lukashenko or Yanukovych from Ukraine, and when Ukraine resembles this kind of Belarusian Russian puppet state. That simply was impossible even prior to Russia's invasions in 2014 and 2022. Now it's simply impossible. The level of hatred of Russia and the Russian people is so high and so deep, this will take decades to overcome. So yes, Ukrainians, of course, are tired of war. That's natural. Yes, Ukrainians maybe want some kind of compromise, but only when that gives them true security, and that would end Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine. Let's see what will happen. I am relatively optimistic that the proposals which will come out will be more favorable towards Ukraine than it will be towards Russia, but time will tell. Thank you for listening to these 7 lectures. It's always great to have some kind of feedback. Please send me that through social media or email or otherwise. And if you need any further information about any of the areas that have been discussed in these 7 lectures, please send me those questions in any format that you wish to do. Thank you again for listening, and goodbye. And let's hope 2025, let's hope and pray 2025 will lead to Ukraine's military victory and Russia's military defeat. Thank you.